Much. Hi, good evening everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So the first thing that I'm going to need you to do is get out your phones because you are going to be asked some questions tonight, so your brains are going to be buzzing. So throughout the talk I'm going to have some questions for you. It's completely anonymous, so please be really truthful and honest. So what you need to do is go to slido.com, so it's up on the slide there, and then enter the event code BRT. So that's slido.com and enter the event code BRT. And as we go along, I'll let you know when there is a question for you to answer. Cool. So my name's Rebecca Gray. I'm a product manager at OVO Energy, and my aim for you tonight is that you'll come away with some practical ways in which you can help yourself or your team to focus more on outcomes rather than outputs. And there's lots of blogs and articles about why outcome-focused teams are really good, lots of autonomy, solving problems. However, there's very little that's out there that's written about how do you practically get there, how do you become an outcome-focused team. So, first of all, let's have a look at what's the difference between an outcome-focused team and an output-focused team. And to help us do that, we first of all need to define what is an outcome. So Joshua Seiden has helpfully defined an outcome as a change in human behaviour that drives business results. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at two imaginary teams. And afterwards I'm going to ask you in the Slido whether you think it's an example of an outcome-focused team or an output-focused team. Okay, so here we go. Imaginary Team A, very snazzy name. So this team, they are really great at focused on releasing continually, and they're hoping to deliver value. They think about what they're going to measure after they've delivered something, or they rely on their PM to do that. Their PM is awesome at telling them what to deliver next. So, are you ready? If you can go into Slido, you should now see a question on your screen if you go to the polls section. And if you can answer the question whether you think it's an outcome-focused team or an output-focused team. Okay, let's see what you've all said. Okay, so well done. Yeah, 88% of you were right. You said this is an example of an output-focused team. So often when you hear teams talking a lot about features or the stuff that they're going to make, and if they forget what they're actually measuring, it's often an example of a team that are more focused on outputs, the things that they're making, rather than outcomes and the human behaviours that they're looking to change. So here's an example of an outcome-focused team. So they're obsessed with solving customer problems. Every team member, if you ask them, they know exactly how they're measuring value, how they're bringing business value and changes for their customers. As a team, they decide on the best way to solve problems. So what about yourself or your own team? Where would you put yourself on a scale of being very output-focused to very outcome-focused? So again, if I'd like you to go into your phones, you might just need to refresh the screen, and it should come up with the next question, which is, on a scale of 1 being very output-focused to 5 being very outcome-focused, where would you put your team? Okay, so, they're still moving. Wow, I definitely want to come and speak to the person who's number 5 and extremely outcome-focused, because my team isn't even there yet, so it'd be great to come and talk to you afterwards. So often when I've done this with other groups of people, it's typically you find that teams are more towards the output focus, so kind of the 2s in the middle there. So it was really actually good and promising to see tonight that there's lots of people who are on their journey to being outcome-focused. So when I asked my team, when I joined, a similar question, I asked them to draw what they think. So on the left-hand side, you have a picture of your typical sort of conveyor belt, feature factory, going off into this black unknown hole. We didn't really know. We were delivering all this stuff, but we didn't actually know what happened to it. And then on the other side, you've got a representation of our backlog, almost like this multi-headed beast. And there's the software engineers trying to chop down this backlog, which just carry on growing arms and heads and legs. So we were definitely stuck in this wheel of outputs. And when we got to the end of our quarterly review, we were going, hey, yeah, look, we delivered all this amazing stuff. It was really great. But when we asked the question, well, so what? You know, what outcome, what change in human behavior, what business result did you drive? We were kind of like, we kind of know, but we really couldn't articulate it because we weren't really measuring. And so how do we make sure then that all the stuff that we're making is actually going to deliver value? And there actually is so much stuff in this world that features that don't actually bring value. And one of the typical ones is, think about your TV remote control. How many buttons on there do you actually use? Like, I've even lost a button on here. I'm not even sure what that button does. To be honest, I don't even know what half the buttons do. So we need to make sure that actually what the stuff that we're making, the things that we're delivering, are they going to bring value, and how do we know that? So, as I said at the beginning of tonight, I'm hoping that you'll come away now with some practical tips of how you can help to move your team or yourself to more outcome focus. And what I want to say is it's not a thing that happens overnight. You'll see from the squiggly line that our team, you know, some weeks we pick up some really good outcome focused habits, and the next week we go into that output wheel and the business suddenly like, yeah, you've got to deliver this, got to live, and we've got to go. So it's definitely a journey, and there's lots of backwards and forwards. Also, health warning, I'm going to show you some tools. Might not necessarily work for you and your team. You might need to adapt it to your environment, but I hope it'll give you some food for thought and something to try out. So tool number one, so define what outcome your team is striving for. And this might sound really obvious, but so many times in businesses, I see businesses giving teams goals like reduce the cost to serve, increase revenue, reduce risk. These are not outcomes. These are high-level impacts. And high-level impacts are too complex to be given to teams and be meaningful. We need to break them down into smaller, more manageable chunks called outcomes. So now you're thinking, how do I define those outcomes? Well, let's go back to our definition of what an outcome is. So an outcome is a change in human behaviour that drives business results. And luckily, someone's helped us, called Joshua Seiden, to define that by his 3 magical questions. Has anyone read this book out of interest? Hands up if anyone's. Okay, massive plot spoiler for everyone. If you don't get this book, I'm going to tell you the best bit about this book. And the best bit is the 3 questions that help you to define what an outcome is and what outcomes your team should be striving for. So the first question he says to ask is, what are the human behaviours that drive business results? So what is it that maybe your customers or users are doing right now that drive the business results? And that leads us to the second question. So how can we get those things that your customers are doing that drive those business results, get them to do them even more? And thirdly, and this is so important, is how do you know you're right? How are you going to measure? How are you going to know you've been successful? So I'll give you an example more closer to home. So in my role with my team, we support a platform for agents in a contact centre. And one of the impacts that we've been asked to do is to reduce the cost to serve. Now, if I just gave that to my team, they'd probably look at me and go, how the heck are we going to do that? So what we did is we used Joshua's questions, and we first of all asked ourselves, what are the agent behaviours that actually lead to maybe an increase in the cost to serve? We also asked the second question, the other way around, what are agents doing, what are the agent behaviours that actually lead to reducing the cost to serve? And when we looked at the agent behaviours that we found were increasing the cost to serve, the one thing that we found is they were spending a lot of time manually entering data that we might already have in our systems. Simple things like a customer's account number, their name. So our outcome was to reduce and help agents spend less time, so that was the behaviour change, spend less time manually inputting data. An example of an output that led to that outcome was we looked at a journey where we had maybe 10 fields where they had to type away manually entering data in. And what we did is we reduced that so they only had to enter 1 field, so we'd automated things. Measuring, how are we going to know we've been successful? So our measurement was that we had a 50% reduction in time of inputting data. Another practical example, so I don't know about you, but I often find sometimes people come and say, hey, I've got this great idea, or in this case, it was about, we really don't like our complaints process at the moment. It's not the best thing. It's really complex. Can you help us make a better complaint process? So the first things, again, what we went through and went do, we asked, what are the human behaviours that drive the business results? And the business results in this case was that a customer leaves satisfied that their complaint has been dealt with and resolved. So in the top row you'll see there's kind of those liked post-it notes, and we looked at like what behaviours do we want from our customers, and then underneath in the orange we looked at what behaviours do we want our agents to be doing. And the things we came up with, for example, is we want them to empathise with the customer. We want them to be able to apologise and say sorry. We want them to be able to ask the right questions to help solve the complaint. We want the agent to be able to ask things like what's going to happen next, so they make sure that the customer understands what's going to happen next or when it's been solved. So there's a practical example of how you can start defining outcomes. So that was tool number one. Tool number two, teams need their own problems to solve. And one thing I would like to ask yourself is, do you find that you're given problems to solve, or is your team given solutions to deliver? And when we were in a sort of very heavily output focused mode, often people come with us with great ideas and we'd be like, yep, that's great, we'll do that. However, it didn't create team ownership. We were almost just shipping things like that picture of things going into that black hole. So I thought to myself, what can we do as a team to actually own those problems? So we're solving those problems. And the first attempt that we did is we went out to our stakeholders and we said to them, could you come and pitch your problem to us in 4 minutes? And the first hurdle that we faced is that if people aren't used to thinking in an outcome-focused way, they will still typically go, here's this idea, or here's this thing, go build it. So we had to spend time with them and actually get them to think about the layers back, and it often ended up there were loads of multiple problems that they were trying to solve. So I think that's one suggestion, is make sure that you talk to people and help them think in an outcome-focused way. This didn't really work for our team, so we still felt like we've been giving a whole load of stuff to just do like a Christmas wish list. So next iteration round, when we came to our planning session, what we did is we looked at our data, we talked to our users, and we came up with some problem statements, and each problem statement we put into a green envelope, put a title on it, and I said to the team, right, you choose the problem that you think most is going to lead to our impact of reducing the cost to serve. And they each went away with their envelope, and the aim was to come up again with a pitch to the team. And what the biggest difference I saw is that they actually took the time to think about and define the problem. And they went to speak to stakeholders on their own, and they had those meetings, and they did all the data analysis. And one thing, a quote I really like from Einstein, he says, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 55 minutes first defining the problem and the last 5 minutes solving it. And I think I've so typically done this myself, just rush into a solution really quickly without actually understanding and defining the problem. So next tool, tool number 3. And almost this tool needs to come before tool number 1. So another problem we found as a team is when we talked about the problems, we didn't really understand the problems enough to be able to solve them. And this is really key, is having face-to-face experiences with customer problems. So again, if you'd like to go to your phones. So I want you to think back, when was the last time you had a face-to-face interaction with your user or customer? Oh, competition over never of 2 months or more. Okay. When we were a very output-focused team, typically one of us in the team, we would go out and be like, yeah, we're the customer-facing person. We'll go and speak to the customer. We'll find out. And then we'll come back and tell the rest of the team. The problem with this approach is it's very difficult to reenact a customer's being really angry or pressing that button multiple times. You can't actually feel that frustration or that joy unless you're actually there face to face with the customer. So our team have made sure that every 2 weeks we are making sure that we're spending quality face-to-face time. We're experiencing that pain with our customers and our users. And one thing I want to say is if you do it for the first time, it comes with a health warning. I didn't actually realise this. I was always like, yeah, go speak to customers. That's amazing. It's going to be great. And some of my team came back and they were like, oh, this is so painful. I've just come back with about 100 bugs I need to fix. So again, can sometimes be painful at the beginning, but worth fighting through. Tool number 4. Think about what you're going to measure. It's so easy, and I've fallen into this trap so many times. We've got carried away with this amazing solution. We're going to ship it and release it. I haven't even thought about how we're going to know that we are right. What are we measuring? So it's really simple, and some tips that I would going to go into, but it's really important. I think this is a really good definition from Teresa Torres. She says an outcome is typically defined by a quantitative metric, a number that is both meaningful to the business and measurable by the team. And I think that's really key. It's a number and it's measurable. So first of all, think about what number. Sometimes it can be quite hard when you're thinking about human behaviours that you're trying to change and how you quantify that and measure that. So think about the number. Also get a baseline if you can, measure it right now. And another thing when thinking about your baseline and maybe your target is, I've seen this happen numerous times, and I've done it, is you've shipped a feature, let's say it's about conversion rates, and you get a conversion rate of 3%, and you're like, oh, that's awesome, that's really good. But actually, if you thought about what you were going to measure and aim for a target, you might have gone for 5%. So it's really easy to be biased once you've released things. The third one, which I think is probably the most important, is make measuring simple. How many times do we literally release one thing and then we go on to the next thing and we forget about what the work that we've done and the difference that's going to make? So make it really easy. Can you have maybe a notification that goes out to your team or yourself every morning? Can you have a Slack message that comes in? Make it measuring really easy. Okay, so I think we've got time for another tool. So this is the last tool that I'm going to go through, and this is thinking about making sure it can be really easy for teams. We can get really excited by the ideas that we come up with and the experiments, but then we can forget how they actually map back to the outcome that we're aiming for and how that outcome then maps back into the impact. So a really good way I find is just simply getting pen or paper, whiteboard, whatever you have nearby, and mapping it all the way back and making sure that every experiment you're doing or every idea that you have, you can map it back to the outcome or you can map it back up to the impact. So here's an example of a board that we have. So we've got our big impact at the top, and then underneath we've got outcomes. So for example, one thing we know that increases the cost to serve is when our agents have to manually sit there with pen and paper, and they do this, pen and paper, and have to calculate maths while they're on the phone to a customer. And below that we then link down to the ideas. So 5 tools to think about to help you become a more outcome-focused team. So first of all, we said tool number 1, define the outcome. Tool number 2, the team needs to own the problems. And in order to really own your problems, you need to understand your problems. And in order to understand your problems, you're going to go and need to have those face-to-face experiences. So make sure you're making time for that. Fourthly, think about what you're going to measure. Think about measuring that before you even start thinking about building anything. And lastly, map it. You might get really excited about the solutions and ideas that you've got, but make sure that actually they're going to link back to an outcome, a change in human behaviour. And make sure that change in human behaviour is actually going to drive your business results. So I hope that will give you some food for thought and some practical ways in how you might become a more outcome-focused team. Thanks very much for listening.
Can you repeat the question, please?
can I repeat the question?
No, when questions come in.
Oh, right, thanks, right. I was like, for a moment, I was like, I'm not sure what the question is. Yes, I can definitely repeat questions. Any questions? Hi.
Thanks very much. Interesting talk. You talked a lot about your team.
Yes.
Who's in your team? What roles are represented within your team when you talk about your team?
Yep, so in our team we have software engineers, we have a UX designer, we have QA and myself. Anything more you'd like to know around that? Or
So you've got one, is that sort of one maybe developer representing a team of developers? So is that how you make up your team?
so we've actually got about 6 developers in our team.
Okay, and they all are involved in this
Yes.
process?
Yeah, but if you'd asked us a year ago, we definitely would not have been speaking to our users. We wouldn't have been thinking about the outcomes. We were very much that picture of a factory of features going into some unknown black hole. Thanks for your question. Sorry, I'll repeat the question this time. Thanks, at the back.
What increase in productivity have you seen from going from an output-driven team to an outcome-driven team?
Okay, so the question was, what productivity or difference in productivity have you seen from going from an output-focused team to an outcome-focused team? So I think the difference is the level of engagement and motivation is the biggest thing. So the team actually care a lot about their users and they're actually thinking every way along they go. And again, if you have more motivated autonomous teams, it's going to naturally lead to that increase in productivity. And I think if you went and asked anyone on my team, they would definitely say that there's been a great increase in productivity. Thanks for your question. Thank you.
So you mentioned that every 2 weeks you listen to your customers or have face-to-face meetings. Is this somehow tied up with sprint times, or how does it work with like software development cycles?
Yeah, so the question is, I mentioned in the talk about how we spend every 2 weeks time with our users and customers. Is that dependent on like the sprint cycle, or how does it work? To be honest, it varies and it depends on the type of work that we're doing. So I'd say probably when we're maybe kicking off at the beginning and trying to understand the problems, we would probably even spend more time. So even today, my team spent lots of time with the CSAs and also listening to calls, so we're directly listening to customers. I don't think there's necessarily like a set rule. I think if you're doing it for the first time, you actually need to book it in your calendar and make it a regular event, otherwise it's not going to happen. No one's going to make it happen for you. So I always say to begin with, probably make it more rigid, but then over time you kind of adapt to what work you're doing or what outcome you're trying to achieve. Thanks for the question.
Can I just build on that? I was just wondering, should it feature therefore in retrospectives and part of the existing ceremonies of the team?
That's a very good question. So the question was, should it feature in retrospectives and other ceremonies of the team? So I think there's different ways of working. So I know some teams, they almost have like product discovery ceremonies, as well as maybe if you're working in Scrum, the typical Scrum ceremonies. Again, I find sometimes that's needed if you're not in the habit. So if you're not normally doing this, if it's not natural for your team to do that, I think sometimes you do need ceremonies. We don't necessarily discuss it in our retrospectives, but what we do very often, and we're probably the most user of sticky notes ever, but after a session we will all stand around the board, we'll look for patterns and we'll go like, what are the key problems? We've also got kind of a Slack channel where anyone who's gone out and listened to a customer, they'll put it in there, so that we're regularly listening and hearing things. But I think, again, depends on your team. If you feel like you're not in the hub of it, then probably stick some meetings in there and ceremonies. We haven't had any particular ceremonies, but I've known teams that have had ceremonies to help them get into this more sort of product discovery mindset. Right at the back there.
Garrett, to follow up on this, how much buy-in do you get from your customers? So how involved do they get? How do they see this?
Okay, so the question was, how much buy-in do you get from our customers? So I'd say we are in a very fortunate position in that our direct users, so our agents, we sit in the same building as them. So we can very easily go and have lots of sessions with our users, and that's really easy. And then also because our customers, we sit with our kind of contact centre, we can sit on the phone listening to the customers. So in terms of our agents and buy-in, they absolutely love it. They love it when something comes out and they know that they co-designed that all the way with us. So buy-in from our users, 100%. Thanks. At the front.
What were the biggest kind of reservations you had maybe within the team as you transitioned to this kind of way of working?
Yeah, so I guess the biggest reservations probably to begin with is, why are we doing this? Or the other one was, well, Rebecca, why don't you go out and do all that? That's great. And then you just tell us what to do. And I was like, nah, that's not fun. Trust me, that's really not fun. So I think, yeah, to begin with, there were reservations. And I think probably some of the hardest things is actually people outside of your team, to bring them along with you and to understand this different way of thinking. Because sometimes I think with outcomes, it might feel to some people outside your team that they don't know necessarily what they're going to get because they haven't specified it. So there's a lot more trust that's then needed in teams. So yeah, definitely reservations at the beginning.
So once you've got that closer engagement with your engineers and the agents, so your customers in this case, and they're excited about what you're building and on that journey with you, did it become a bit of a hindrance to the team where agents repeatedly getting hold of engineers and saying, hey, I've got this problem, I've got this idea, and if so, how did you manage that?
Okay, so the question was, so as we were kind of spending more and more time with our agents, and did that then become kind of a hindrance to the team, as in were they sort of reaching out to us and going, hey, I've got this and I've got that. I think it's how you manage that and how you funnel that conversation. So for example, we don't have sort of our users directly, individually contacting. We provide ways for them to do that. So we have like a Slack channel where they can provide feedback straight into that. I think you do have to manage it carefully, because that's the other thing. Again, when I first said about people going to listen to customers for the first time and coming back with this whole list of bugs, it's really easy to feel really pressured down by that and then get really frustrated when you come back to your team and they're like, no, we're not solving that problem right now. We need to solve this one. It can feel really frustrating not to be able to then solve that. So I think it's, again, then you need to go back to your map and think about where you're going. But again, on the communication, I think it's just about managing it and making sure that one person isn't getting all of that feedback, for example, and then trying to solve everyone's problem. But thanks for the question. Thanks, Nick.
How you would sell this to a skeptical management? Is a new approach that they may be unfamiliar with?
Yep. So the question was, how would you sell this to a skeptical management? And I think that's a very important question. And again, a little bit on what I touched on to previous question is that with this approach, people aren't often clear right at the beginning, because you're thinking about the human behaviours and not sure exactly what they're going to get. And I think it's about taking them on a journey with you. So, you know, I've spent time with individuals just asking them lots of questions, and sometimes they don't necessarily have nailed down the problems that they need to solve. So I think you have to have that really good trusted relationship with people, communicate really well. I'm sure all of us will understand the importance of communication and doing that regularly so that they can be brought along on that process. What I found useful is normally trying to get them involved right at the beginning, and then make sure, maybe if it's not just necessarily them, but someone that can feed back to them who wants to be more heavily involved. So I think it's involvement. We're very lucky, I'd say, at OVO, that we are really trusted in our teams to get on and we can try new things out. But I've been in other companies where that maybe not quite the case. But experiment. You can always say, look here, we're going to experiment with this new approach. Let's see if it works. Thanks. At the back. That's a good question. So the question was, have you used this with remote teams? This approach, no, I've worked with remote teams in the past. I haven't necessarily used this exact approach using Joshua Siden's questions, but I don't see why it can't work. So, for example, what I've done with one team, a team that were out in Poland, and we were like, okay, so our customers are UK based. How are we going to make sure that they can have some, as close as possible, face-to-face interactions? So we used to do some user testing labs, and we used to make sure that it was all fully recorded so they can visually see it. Again, it's not exactly the same as being able to sit there live and almost feel the sweat of the person next to you. But I think you can make it happen. Thanks.
If your team is purely focused on outcome-related results,
Mm-hmm.
does that preclude you focusing on technical depth?
Okay, so it's a good question. The question was, if your team is focused on outcomes, does that kind of preclude you from working on technical depth? My answer would be absolutely definitely not. So, for example, our team are working on technical debt at the moment, but again, we asked ourselves, what is the business result that we're driving and aiming for? And we were able to link that back. So I definitely think you can use it for technical debt as well. I think that's all questions. Thank you very much for your time tonight, and I hope that was practical and useful.